Now, the big problem was, and I must admit to being a skeptic when geodiversity was first coined, I really did wonder what it was about. But after a couple of conferences where we kicked the idea about with Natural England, it was quite clear that what we're looking at is the abiotic side of the planet and how it relates to the biotic side. And when you look in detail, geodiversity really does control biodiversity. And one of the most classic places is what you've got in the picture there, which is Berry Head, because that calcareous grassland on Berry Head, which is one of the main sites of the Geopark, that calcareous grassland has a peculiar assemblage of plants. It's got a whole collection of butterflies, and all of these rely on those calcareous soils to generate that assemblage. In other words, the biodiversity features of Berry Head are the direct result of the geodiversity. And all around Tor Bay, we can see this relationship between what are the rocks and what is the vegetation and the animals that live on that vegetation. So I think it's now rooted in the literature. Although I must admit, as an editor, I get a complete host of papers of people trying to do statistical tests on it all. And some of those are a little bit tedious, to put it bluntly, but never mind. I suppose my mathematics stopped at some levels of statistics, and maybe I haven't caught up with myself yet. But anyway, you know the Geopark is a coastal geopark, and we can use the Geopark to explain climate change, sea level, carbon sequestration processes, landscape evolution, early hominin history, and a whole host of other important features which make it a unique location. We're also, to be honest, the home of the Devonian System, which is part of our geological record, used by everyone in the world that does geoscience. So, Tor Bay, and of course you do get into trouble these days when you want to write Tor Bay as two words or Tor Bay as one word, and editors of journals never seem to understand the difference. But Tor Bay is an important marine conservation zone, which is a subset of the Lime Bay Special Area of Conservation, which was designated in April 2000. The Marine Conservation Zone was designated in 2013. And our geopark is, I can't say if it's absolutely unique, but it's one of the very few geoparks in the world where we have such a high concentration of marine sites associated with the area. So what I want to look at is a little bit of geoconservation, geological history, and then look at some of the climate change features of raised beaches, submerged forests, cave deposits, etc. So where do we start? Well, one of the reasons for the geopark being included in the list of global geoparks is the fact that we have such a plethora of geological sites. From the Geological Conservation Review, sites of special scientific interest, national nature reserves, areas of outstanding natural beauty. locally important regional sites and county geological sites. And then we've got the marine environment with the Marine Conservation Zone. Many of those sites of special scientific interest were designated because they were significant in the designation of the area as being the home of the Devonian System. And that is important. The other important thing to recognize is that while the UNESCO title is important in a whole host of ways, just as it is on the Dorset coast as the World Heritage Site, UNESCO status does not bring any geoconservation legislation. In other words, we rely on the national system for geological sites and national nature reserves and all the other things that are listed there. And therefore it is mainly through Natural England and local management of Natural England sites that gives us our absolutely important position within the geological community. Now, the geological map of Devon, and that's a very simplistic one. You know that we have the lower Devonian or the lower and middle Devonian rocks, grey in the north of the county and the south of the county. We have the Mesozoic and later rocks to the east of the county in those beige, green, blue colors. And you see there the geopark located. And within the Devonian strata, there are these pale, I'm not quite sure what color they are. They're a sort of dirty green color. That's a bit disrespectful, but these are the limestones that run across from Berry Head in the south of Torbay to Hope's Nose in the north of Torbay, inland to Newton Abbot, up to Chudley, Buckfast, and then across to these locations near to Plymouth, which are also part of this Devonian limestone. And the important thing to remember is that from the early Devonian, which is here, when we were round about 10 degrees south of the equator, to the present day, where we are 52 degrees north of the equator, that transition by plate movements migrating our region across the globe is the reason for most of our great geodiversity, because that history of movement across the planet is so crucial. Well, we know it's a slow process. I always say it's about the rate that your fingernails grow. But it does mean that through geological time, we have migrated northwards as well as westwards in places. And of course, we're still migrating northwards at the present time. So when we look at Devon, variations in climate are due to, obviously, our position on the planet, driven by the process of plate tectonics, but also the variations in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, which control the hydrosphere and the cryosphere. In other words, the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere controls global climate, and that controls the balance between water vapor, ice, and water on the planet. A quite fundamental set of processes. Now, when we look at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, sorry about the graph here, but that's about 600 million years. And of course, when you look at carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and I show this slide, people look at where we are today, the little red circle, and think, well, why are we all banging on about carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? We've hardly got any. And look at the geological past. We had huge amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And of course, we know what controls this curve. Clearly, the origin of land plants changed all this, locked up all the carbon dioxide. And then the plankton in the oceans has been controlling what we've seen through the Mesozoic. But here we are today with the present day levels of carbon dioxide. And if we look at the graph on the right, which shows the cold-warm distribution through time, you could, with a very bendy ruler, draw a straight line down through that graph, which indicates that the Earth is getting colder. Well, that's really not going to be true, because the luminosity of the sun has been going up by about 30% during the lifespan of that graph. And of course, the reason why that increase in temperature has been ameliorated is because of life on Earth. And James Lovelock, in the Gaia theory he put out, obviously got some of it, not maybe perhaps correct in terms of the fossil record, but the concept that life controls the climate is very important. Now, when we look at our famous chalk cliffs, we're up in here, very warm conditions, very high carbon dioxide, not as high as here, but very high carbon dioxide levels. Some people go to argue as to whether it was 8 times the present value or 12 times. Probably doesn't matter. There's a bit of an academic argument. But that's where the chalk is. And then we come into the Cenozoic. And the most important kick, although it doesn't show up too much, is that transition from the Eocene to the Oligocene, which is when land ice really appears on Antarctica. And it appeared on Antarctica around about 48, 45 million years ago. And it only appeared in the northern hemisphere with the freezing of the Arctic Ocean when you get into the later stages of that graph up in the Quaternary. So in the early Devonian, we've got a fair idea of what the paleogeography looked like. And if I had to put a little point where Torquay was, it would be where the red star is. In a very complex situation, bordering an ocean environment. And of course, when we look at what you expect, around about 10, maybe 15 at the extreme, but if we go for 10 degrees south of the equator, we're looking at the production of carbonates, shallow water limestones that are full of corals, trilobites, brachiopods. And if you go to Hope's Nose and look at the limestones along here and in the quarry here, what you see are these beds of thin-bedded limestones, some thicker units. But the other interesting thing is that we also find volcanic ashes. Now, this volcanic ash, which is here, is round about 16 centimeters thick. It's graded. What we mean by graded is the coarse particles are at the bottom, becomes finer to the top. Now, deposited in water and burying corals that were living on the sea floor, that is a very non-scientific term, I know, but a very chunky ashfall. Normally, you never see ashfall deposits that thick. And it really, when you think of the dispersion of ash through the water column, this must have been a huge eruption. And of course, Sedgwick and Murchison, when they were looking at these limestones on Hope's Nose, they noted the fossils, they noted the ashfall deposits, they looked at the stratigraphy. But of course, the interesting thing in this region is that Sir Henry de la Beche, who published a huge monograph in 1839, just before Sedgwick and Murchison identified the Devonian, de la Beche came up with a suggestion that there was a geological system that hadn't got a name. The only trouble was he got part of the geology of North Devon slightly upside down, and he mistook some of the plants and he mixed them up with carboniferous plants. But there was this huge controversy between Sedgwick, Murchison, and de la Beche, and some of his followers, in understanding what went on. And in the end, although de la Beche published on it, it was Sedgwick and Murchison that rather gazumped him into naming the Devonian System. But that's a long story, and if you want to read the book, it's worth reading, but it's about 400 pages long. So there we are, there's Torquay, and you see there's a little volcano, or a big volcano, parked somewhere up the Lemon Valley near Newton Abbot. And we also have volcanoes across in the Tamar Valley and across in Cornwall. Now, we know we had a shallow sea with coral reefs. They're limited to about 25, 26 meters water depth. But I'm never sure about the deep sea that's put on that diagram. Everyone says it's deep sea, but I don't necessarily believe that, because one, there were ostracods living in it that don't look deep water to me. The other thing is the deep sea came from the fact that there was no carbonate in it. But if you think of the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, the oceans must have been very depleted in calcium carbonate, away from the carbonate factories of the coral reefs. So I don't think it was that deep a sea, but we can argue about that, and it gives geologists something to do whenever they get together to have an argument. But of course, the fossils are absolutely wonderful. The mid-Devonian corals, brachiopods, some of the little gastropods and trilobites, they're absolutely wonderful. And in particular, if you can climb down to Hope's Nose, you see these wonderful grey blobs in the rock, which are stromatoporoids. They were thought to be calcareous sponges, although I wouldn't have a bath with one of those. They've got very calcareous structures. And of course, their shape is quite characteristic of where they were living on the reef. Some were in turbulent water, some weren't. And the shape of them does vary, although you have to be very careful. There was an interesting paper written on the shape of these stromatoporoids, and all they were the strain ellipses from where these rocks have been folded. So when you look at the reconstructions of the stromatoporoids, you have to think of unfolding the rocks and changing the shape back to their original form. Perfectly doable, but some people forget to do it. We always think of Ussher as, I don't know, the father of geology in southwest England. Ussher mapped the area for the British Geological Survey. 2020 was the centenary of his death. And this is Ussher's map. And he described all the things like the London Bridge and the gold from Hope's Nose. And we obviously remember him fondly by using his name for the Usher Society. But our understanding of the southwest of England stems back to a lot of his work. And of course, one of the things he struggled with, and I'm not going to explain that tectonic diagram at the top left, but southwest England is a very complex area with a whole series of structurally controlled basins. Later granites poke through that and distort the distribution of these folded sediments that form these basins. And you can see these folds everywhere. Here's a beautiful overturned fold sitting on a thrust. Most of you might know that as being on the ore stone just off Hope's Nose. Here's a little fold in Goodrington. And I always remember when we had the Global Geopark Network conference, the Chinese wanted us to put signs up and explain all what was going on. And we told them, no, we sit our students in front of it and get them to work out what's going on. We don't put signs up to tell them. And there's a whole host of geological structures in here, which really are worth description. But when that folding took place, and we ended up with a mountain range that may have had hills, mountains, do you want to call them? 2,500 to 3,000 meters high running through southwest England. After that, we were in this rather strange situation of almost a global continent known as Pangaea. And Pangaea dominated the whole of the planet in many ways. And the important thing for biology is that normally things migrate along latitude, east-west. Most organisms cannot migrate north-south, particularly if you've got a glaciation down at the southern end of the Earth. And so Pangaea formed a barrier, and that wasn't the cause for the mass extinctions at that time, but it certainly didn't help biological communication because it cut off all the migration routes that were possible. So what did we have? We had a fold belt in southwest England. And when we look at the geological map, the grey on that map is the Devonian, and the orange around Paynton and Torquay is what we call the Permian, the Torbay Breccia Formation. These terrestrial rocks. And these terrestrial rocks, particularly the Torbay Breccias, are really characteristic. You've all seen them as the red rocks of Torquay. And it's characteristic of the landscape around the Devonian rocks to see these red sandstones. Now, it's quite an interesting succession, but it's not very easy to date it because these are coarse terrestrial deposits with virtually no fossils in them. Now, there are fossils. You can see in the bottom left some burrows, and these are trace fossils. In other words, they're not the fossil, but they are traces left by the fossil. And so there you see some very fine burrows that we might surmise an organism. I'm trying not to call it a worm, but it might well look like that. Passed the sediment through its gut and presumably extracted organic material from it. In the top left, no self-respecting animal would pass that through its gut. It's far too coarse. So this is a backfilled burrow system. And we've got reasonable ideas as to what some of these organisms were, but they are not going to give us a stratigraphy to work out the age of these rocks. But when we look at the cliffs all around Torbay, we can see these characteristically chaotic sediments. In some places, they're beautifully layered. In other places, they're conglomeratic and full of local limestone boulders. And of course, we try to think of how these formed. And of course, when I worked out in Oman, I've got to be careful these days because we found the 5th biggest oil field in the world out there, and I'll probably have the anti-petroleum people knocking on my door in about 5 minutes. But never mind, we were there for a purpose. And when you look at these rocks, you can see all the structures that we see in these sediments in Torquay. But these are Pleistocene deposits in the Oman Mountains. Pleistocene because during the Ice Age, the Middle East was wet. It was in a pluvial situation. And we have these torrential deposits pouring out of valley systems, literally filling valleys up, choking some of them with these deposits, just like the ones in Torquay. Now you might say, well, why aren't they red? Well, the Torquay ones have been buried below the surface. They've been in contact with groundwater. Iron minerals have rusted, so they've all become red. These ones in the Oman have never been buried, although if you dig down into the foundations of some of these developments in the Middle East, you do see that they're gradually turning red with depth. So this is a pretty good idea of what Torbay looked like. And I suppose the top picture there could be Totnes Road going up from Paignton towards Dartmoor. Yeah, it's a bit fanciful, but it's nice to think of. But of course, those desert-like conditions remained throughout the Trias. In the Jurassic, southwest England was essentially an island. And in the Cretaceous, when sea levels were very high, Dartmoor was flooded. How do we know Dartmoor was flooded? Well, if you go up onto the top of Holden Hill and go to some parts of North Devon, not far from Bideford, you can actually find flints, and real flints from the chalk. And in those flints, you can find sea urchin fossils, bivalve fossils, sponges. So we know that the Cretaceous covered much of southwest England because sea level was 100, probably 150 meters above present levels. But of course, as I mentioned earlier, after the Eocene, the glaciation began in the Antarctic and then migrated to the Arctic, and we went into an icehouse world. And of course, to understand the icehouse, you really have to do a little bit of mathematics. And one of my absolute heroes is James Kroll. He was a very sickly individual. He had a whole host of dead-end jobs, but eventually became the janitor at Glasgow Caledonian University. And that gave him a pass key. And the pass key opened the library, so he taught himself astronomy. He taught himself mathematics. And he was the first person who linked astronomical movements to climate. I mean, when you think of it, self-taught mathematician, astronomer, back in the middle of the 19th century. But of course, we now all remember Milutin Milankovitch, who took Kroll's work, at times not often acknowledging it very well, But Milutin-Milankovitch really did develop the whole concept of astronomical cycles. And of course, we could not look at climate change without looking at what we see in these Milankovitch cycles, which in the later part of the Pleistocene are 100,000 years. And so these Milankovitch cycles that you see here from temperature or from carbon dioxide concentration, these are astronomically moderated variations. Now, the important thing to remember is that nowhere in our last 500,000 years does the carbon dioxide concentration get above about 285 parts per million. So that is a restriction. But when we look at the Vostok ice cores, there's our temperature change on 100,000 year cyclicity. There's our carbon dioxide. And of course, they fit. So the direct relationship between temperature, carbon dioxide, and volume of ice caused by the climate. And of course, now we're up here. I went on the NOAA, that's the American website, and as of lunchtime today, it is 421 parts per million. That slide's, apologies, it's slightly out of date. But as of lunchtime today, it's about 421 parts per million. You've got to be very careful because the carbon dioxide content in the atmosphere fluctuates with the deciduous trees in the northern hemisphere. So you've got to be very careful that your reading is what you want it to be. So, but it's quite clear that we have this direct relationship. And so we can construct, and this is Chris Proctor's little cartoon that appeared in the Devonshire Association. You can see our interglacials in green, and there we are today. We can see the last glacial maximum, the one before that, the one before that, the one before that. This is a geological metronome ticking away, giving us a chronology. And onto this, we can look at raised beaches. And here we are in an interglacial. We can look at cave deposits, whether they're in Sherford in Plymouth, Buckfast, Kent's Cavern. All these caves have megafauna, and in some cases, hominin remains that we can tie in to positions within this record. And so the Kent's Cavern teeth, molars, were about 42,000 years old. The tusks that have been dug out of Sherford near Plymouth are about 33,000 years old. And we can date all these megafauna through the geological record. We can see the raised beaches. There's the Hope's Nose raised beach, just as it's here. We can also look at fossil forests or submerged forests in Daymar Bay and near Padstow. If you walk along from Lympston up the estuary, you can find tree stumps all the way along, all of which can be dated as around about 2,800, 2,900 years ago. And so all these features of climate change that we want to wrap up into a story of how this planet is working can be tied together using James Kroll and Milutin-Milankovitch's cyclicity. And using these stable isotopes, it is really important that we can convince people about the way in which our climate has changed and is changing. Many of you who are geologists will have heard the phrase that James Hutton used, that the present is the key to the past. In other words, modern day processes can interpret the geological record, present key to the past. Now, more than ever, we use the phrase, the past is the key to the future, because looking at the geological record, looking at ocean acidification, looking at variations in climate, it is the geological record that gives us this. And it's all sitting in our Geopark. And that's absolutely fundamental as to what the Geopark is about, to communicate and educate people as to what is going on. And the caves are magnificent. I haven't got time to explore it now, but underneath Berry Head, there's some caves that are below sea level. And they have marine microfossils in them. But those marine microfossils only get in during interglacials when sea level's high, because during the glacial times, there was no water in the English Channel. And so what we have in the Berry Head caves is a record with marine microfossils, which we can compare to the megafauna record in the terrestrial caves. Now, I don't know many places in Europe where we have a marine and a terrestrial cave record. And if that proves to be absolutely true, then it makes the Geopark even more important. So what we're looking at, and here's the entrance to one of these caves. When the tide comes in, this fills up with water. When the tide goes out, it empties. And within this cave, we have a whole series of muddy layers that are full of microfossils. And some of those microfossils come from the seagrass meadows. And the seagrass meadows of Tor Bay are absolutely fantastic. They are a carbon sink. The only problem is that all the marine biologists are looking at these as a carbon sink. But the problem is that if you drill a hole, or if I drill a hole through here, 20 centimeters down, there's no organic remains at all. They've all gone. So they're not a carbon sink. However, the carbonate microfossils that live on the seagrass, they're all still there. And those pink things down the bottom there, they're only pink because I stained them to show they were living. They are from one leaf of a seagrass plant. It was so covered in these epibionts. And they're, of course, filling up the sediment between the seagrass beds. And they're being picked up and shoved into the caves on Berry Head when each tide flows in and out. Wonderful starga, really needs a lot more work. Now, the big bad message, which I'm coming to the end now, is you've seen that curve. There's our curve, which shows that very few peaks approached CO2 levels in the past. Look where it is today. I mean, this is just crazy. As I say, we're about 421. Now, my concern, and I'm sorry about the graph at the bottom being rather busy, shall we say, but it's based on boron isotopes, it's based on paleo soils, it's based on stomata in leaves of plants, looking at the age from the present day on the left and looking at carbon dioxide concentrations. Now, I deliberately put the red line in at about 500 parts per thousand. Now you can see that even where we are at 421, we're into the realm of what things were like on this planet 5 million or 10 million or 15 million years ago. That is where the carbon dioxide levels are headed. And of course, if you go back to the Miocene, 12 million years ago, sea levels were 25 meters higher than today. Now, 25 meters, I mean, when you look at the Newland tide gauge, they tell you quite happily that sea levels going up 2.3 millimeters a year. Oh, that sounds calming and reassuring. But if somebody said, well, I'm sorry, but in the next few decades or centuries, it's going to go up 25 meters, you do have a bit of a problem. And of course, there's all sorts of mitigation going on. People are rewilding some of our estuaries, but I'm afraid that won't be enough if sea levels go up to the level that the carbon dioxide looks like it's taking us. Now, when COP26 met, they all clapped, cheered, banged gabbles on the desk, and swore blind they were going to stick to 1.5 degrees centigrade, which of course is laughable because 1 in 3 days this year, we've been above that level already. And what's happening is we're seeing anthropogenic carbon dioxide, bleaching corals, changing the acidification of the water. It's already happening. And this is what bleached corals look like. The ones in the Devonian never got to that stage. But when we look at what sort of things happen, people talk about short duration, heavy rainfall events because the atmosphere is so warm it can hold more water moisture. Well, look at what happened in Scotland last weekend. Look at what happened in Ken and Ottery St Mary 10 days ago. Look at the wildfires we've seen this year. It's happening, and I think we're asleep at the wheel. We've all seen these pictures. I don't want to over dramatize it. And then, of course, in 2022, we had that high temperature of 40.3 degrees, which we could not have got to without global warming. Physically, we could not have got to that level at 52 degrees north without global warming. So I don't want to end on a depressing note. What I want to end on is the fact that the English Riviera Global Geopark has a lot of these stories wrapped up in it. And you only have to walk out to have a look at them. They're accessible. You can see the raised beaches. You can see the link between biodiversity and geodiversity. Just walk along the top of Berry Head and it's all there to see. And what we have, as well as our history of being the home of the Devonian, I do believe that we do have a very interesting story to tell. And particularly if our cave deposits turn into terrestrial caves with megafauna and marine caves with microfauna, I think that will be actually a game changer in terms of recent history of our planet's climate. Anyway, thank you for listening. I hope you found at least 1 or 2 words interesting, and I hope by looking at all those global changes at the end, not too frightening. But I'm sorry, there's no easy way of saying it.
Well, thank you very much, Malcolm. That was a fascinating insight into the geology that we've got here. I think every time I listen to you talk, Malcolm, it's I learn obviously something new every time, and it's just it is such an extraordinary place, isn't it, where we live here. I have to say, driving to Totnes now, I'm always going to think of Oman and that slide. That was a wonderful the idea of mountains and all those things. So great. Well, look, there's not many of us in here this evening. So, Malcolm, do you want to just stop sharing your screen, and then if you want to put your cameras on, and if anybody's got any questions, then that would be great. You can, yeah. Let's So, is anybody? Let me see, make sure I can see everybody. There we go. Has anybody got any? I don't see any hands up, but no. That's and yeah, there's 25 of us joining it this evening. So, anybody got any questions for Malcolm?
Yeah, I've got a couple.
Ah, there we go. So, is Anna, is it?
Yes, Anna Grayson.
Hello, Anna.
Yes, in case people don't know, I'm a geologist by training, with a bit of a career behind me, but I'm now retired and work as an artist. Malcolm, I was just typing there that that was a really interesting talk, and thank you very much. And I have to say, I think that's the first time I've heard some really solid science coming out of the Geopark. I've just got a couple of questions and clarifications. The first one, the Holden Hills. I think it's very sad that the Holden Hills and the Dartmoor are not within the Geopark. To me, my mind, the Geopark is rather confined to the Devonian of Torquay, and there's so much more interesting stuff outside. In the Holden Hills, the marine transgression is really interesting, and of course, you get evidence for the Miocene warming episode there as well. Is there really any hard evidence for these rocks, these Cretaceous rocks, to have covered Dartmoor? I've not seen it myself, but I may be wrong.
Well, there are occasional records of flints being found in some of the head deposits around Dartmoor, but I personally have not seen them. But if you take the deposits around Bideford in North Devon and the ones on Holden Hill, and extrapolate across, now I know that's geologists like to draw cross sections and put rulers on them, but if you do that, you do get the impression that it would have been buried. Of course, the big problem is, post the Cretaceous, you've eroded the whole thing away.
Except on Holden, I mean, there's still quite a succession.
Well, on Holden, you've still got some of it preserved. And as I say, you've got this stuff at Buckland Brewer up near Bideford. But these are all almost isolated pockets. Of course, the Holden ones are sitting on top of a lower Cretaceous succession or mid-Cretaceous succession.
It's green sand. There's a clear green sand layer, which appears to, in places, to be an aquifer. And I'm not sure, having walked that area time and time again, particularly during lockdown, nobody seems to have drawn any isopachyites of that green sand layer, but I don't think it's as uniform as it makes out on the map, because on the odd places, I mean, there's almost no exposure, but where you do see the green sand at the bottom of the flint gravels, it seems to be varied, and it does look to me as if it is a marine transgression coming from the east, and they look fairly shallow water. I mean, I noticed laminated sandstones the other day. I didn't pick the specimen up, which I probably should have, but it's really interesting. And now that's perched right on top of a hill, which is saying a lot about earth processes, and I think that's marvelous. But no, I've not seen any evidence in Dartmoor. You're talking about North Devon. Perhaps I don't know whether I can add a clarification. You're talking about, I know what you mean when you look at the North Devon rocks, and it's very hard to believe that they really are deep water. But I seem to remember reading some stuff when I was an undergraduate about the sequence of those sedimentary rocks, and that the pattern they form, I don't think we use the word cyclothem anymore, and it's that repeating pattern that's very much like things that are going on the Grand Banks today, and that's what told people that they were deep water. But I was there quite recently looking at the succession and thinking, goodness me, I've forgotten all this, how frightful. But that's what I was told. And I think the book was called Ancient Sedimentary Environments by Dick Selly. Is somebody you familiar with? It was a very readable book.
Dick and I worked together for 20 years.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
You know,
Great
so you
guy.
know the book.
I know the book and I know him. I mean, the interesting thing is, I mean, part of my PhD was on the green sands of the Holden Hills.
Oh, really?
And well, I started off at Beer and worked west.
Yeah.
But I mean, the important thing there is that there are, on Holden Hill, there's a coral bed within the green sand. There are microfossils within the green sand things. Well, I could drop all the names, but that's irrelevant.
One day, Malcolm, please, will you? I'd be really, really interested to find out more.
Oh, well, it's all been published. I mean, those, particularly the relationship between the Alla gravels down near Newton Abbot and the gravels up on Holden Hill. I've got a lovely picture of the late Clive Nicholas looking at some of these fossils. They're really beautiful microfossils, except they're not microfossils. They're rather larger than average, and they're unusual because they normally don't occur in the British Isles, but they get this far north once. But it makes them more interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Sorry to sort of hog this, but one thing you mentioned that your Chinese delegation had asked for information boards. I do wonder, I mean, I take your point that when you're taking undergraduates there, you want them to see it and interpret it for themselves. But I just wonder whether it would be the communication with the general public would be better if there were more information boards, and whether the term geopark would mean more to the man and woman in the street of Torbay.
That is true, but when I was on that particular trip, they were wanting a full geological tectonic explanation of the fold. And I was adamant that no, we want our students to work that out. That's part of their training. And I think, yes, you have to think very carefully about.
You need different language if you're communicating with the general public, and
but there are boards there.
But France coming and pushing into Britain and things getting a bit heated is understandable, and the fact that these folds, even though they're hard rock, the fact that solid rock can form into folds is wonderful, and just to engage people and to get them to stand and stare at that and take it in, I think would be wonderful.
Oh, it is.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you for that. And yeah, there's some really good stuff. Communicating geology is of course the trick of what the Geopark tries to do, and do it in a way that that tries to make it available to the public. But that needs funding, it needs resources, and that's something that we're looking at. Bruce, can I bring you in?
Yeah, well, thank you. I was going to ask on that theme, what data are there, what evidence is there that the Geopark attracts the person on the street who has no geological background and therefore wants to be informed? What numbers come, do you know?
Yeah. So the quantifying statistics on what brings the 4 million visitors that come to the English Riviera, that's the number, the official number that the tourist board are always going on about, 4 million people, of which some are staying, some are just day visitors. I think it's very difficult to get that statistic. It's very unlikely that the majority are not coming because it's a geopark. But I think what the role of the geopark is to, when they get here, that rather than just come for the beaches, come for the sand, and that they're now coming for the natural environment. And if we can try and get that across in a way, and maybe some of the messages that Malcolm was alluding to in terms of what messages can the Geopark bring across about climate change, about the sustainability of what everybody's habits are. I think that's very much what the Geopark can go forward to. Getting all the partners who are involved in the Geopark. The Geopark is a partner organization. It involves all the different bodies, so the Coast and Countryside Trust, the museums, the scientific institutions, some of the national bodies as well, to kind of work together, and that's always challenging, particularly when there is no real budget. But you may have seen the news about the Heritage Lottery Fund in the last 24 hours, which I think is going to bring some great opportunity to raise the value of the natural environment to the heritage, the heritage of the natural environment as much as the built environment, and that will, Bruce, definitely needs some quantifiable data behind it to demonstrate the need for that information to attract visitors here. But visitors, we don't want mass tourism. We want people to come here and to enjoy it, and in a way that is sustainable.
Thank you.
Hi, Bruce.
Hi, Malcolm.
Long time no see.
Yeah. I just wonder about people often talk about geology who wish to deny the effects of humans on the planet or the significance of it. So, oh, I know that in the Cambrian or in the Precambrian, the CO2 was right off the scale, so we needn't worry. There isn't that sort of basic understanding, perhaps. How do we get that basic understanding across?
No, it's very difficult, because you do run into preconceptions. I mean, I remember being on a boat around the Caribbean island of Montserrat doing some research, not cruising, and there were two Americans who were really believed in everything was deposited by Noah's flood. And yet behind them there was a volcano going off with lava spewing all over the place at about 1200 degrees centigrade.
Right.
And they still couldn't switch to the idea that it was that problem. I don't know. There are some people who are never going to be able to adjust to it. But I mean, that curve that I moved up and showed how it fitted. A lot of the oil companies, of course, say, oh, well, it was the temperature that brought up the carbon dioxide and not the other way around. You can't win, but never mind.
Very good. Well, look, we've reached our hour, so I think unless there's anybody with a specific question for Malcolm, I think I don't see any hands raised. So can I thank you all for joining us this evening, and in particular to thank Malcolm. Malcolm, thank you so much for a really, really fascinating hour celebrating International Geodiversity Day. So thank you very much, and hopefully we'll do more of these, because it's been really good. Thank you very much, and good night.